The phone buzzed across the table. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as her eyes quickly fell upon the message that lit up the screen. It was from Jake, her partner. The message read, "Can't wait to see you tonight." She felt a chill run through her as she looked up at Jake, who was sitting across the room. He was laughing, completely unaware that the barrier between them had just cracked wide open. The betrayal was in plain sight, and Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd suspected something was wrong, but now, seeing the confirmation in black and white, it felt as if her entire world had just shifted. There was no going back. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her love, was suddenly a lie. Jake's smile seemed to mock her, and Sarah, though stunned, could already feel the storm brewing within her. She opened the message again, replaying the words in her mind. "Can't wait to see you tonight." Her breath hitched. Sarah placed her phone down, her fingers trembling, but the buzzing in her mind refused to stop. The quiet sound of Jake sipping his coffee echoed in her ears. Each movement he made seemed louder now. She stared at him, trying to make sense of everything. Her stomach churned with a mix of anger and disbelief. Could he have really been hiding this from her all this time? The realization hit like a wave, knocking her breath out. The man she trusted, the one she thought she knew so well, had just shattered her world with a single message. She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She needed answers, but the thought of confronting him left a knot in her throat. How could she even begin to ask the questions swirling in her head? Sarah's mind raced, and all she could focus on was the sudden, unshakable sense of betrayal that filled the air between them. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Jake looked up at her, surprised, his casual smile faltering for a moment. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. Sarah clenched her fists, struggling to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to spill over. "What's going on, Jake?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His confusion deepened as he set his coffee down, sensing something was off. Sarah's mind raced through 100 possible questions, but the one that kept rising to the surface was the hardest one to ask. "Who were you texting just now?" The words hung in the air, and Jake's expression faltered for a split second. He quickly recovered, but Sarah noticed the tiny shift. He hesitated before answering, and in that pause, Sarah felt the truth begin to sink in. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the silence between them deafening. Jake leaned back in his chair, a slight frown forming on his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, attempting to downplay the situation. But Sarah could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the discomfort. "I'm asking you, Jake. Who are you texting?" Sarah's voice wavered, but she forced herself to sound calm. The longer he avoided answering, the more her suspicions grew. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, not yet. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Jake, on the other hand, seemed more concerned with his own discomfort than with the situation at hand. He shifted in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing," he said quickly, but Sarah could see through the lie. She knew. The truth was out there, and she needed to hear it, no matter how much it hurt. The silence between them stretched as Sarah waited for him to finally come clean. Jake sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Look, it's not what you think," he muttered, his voice low. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she heard the same lie she had heard so many times before. "I don't want to hear it, Jake," she said, cutting him off, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "I saw the message. I know everything." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She had hoped for a different answer, something that would explain away the growing dread in her gut, but there was no escaping the truth. Jake's face twisted with frustration as he tried to reason with her. "It's not like that," he began, but Sarah was already shaking her head. "You don't get to lie to me anymore," she said, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. The emotional wall between them had gone up, and Sarah realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The night after the confrontation felt like an eternity to Sarah. She couldn't shake the image of Jake's face as he denied everything. It had been hard to sleep, her mind swirling with questions she didn't want to ask. The next day, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in front of her. Everything about her life now felt like a lie. She wondered if she'd ever truly known Jake at all. Was their entire relationship built on a foundation of secrets? The silence between them was suffocating. But it wasn't just because of what happened last night. It was a silence that had been growing for months, maybe even years. Sarah remembered all the small things she had ignored before, all the tiny cracks in their relationship that now seemed so obvious. Was she foolish for not seeing the signs sooner? But then, was it her fault? Had she somehow pushed him away? The self-doubt gnawed at her, and she couldn't escape the feeling that the betrayal had already changed her forever. Days passed and the silence between them stretched on. Jake had tried to talk to her, but Sarah wasn't ready to hear any more of his excuses. The walls between them had only grown taller. She began noticing things she hadn't before. The late nights, the evasive answers, the little glances that didn't add up. Sarah found herself questioning every moment she had spent with Jake, wondering if it had all been fake. She couldn't look at him the same way anymore. The warm, loving man she had known now seemed like a stranger. Their home, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and empty. Sarah felt like she was watching her life unravel from the outside, helpless to stop it. She was paralyzed by her own emotions, torn between wanting to believe him and knowing that her trust had been shattered beyond repair. The sense of betrayal loomed over her every day, threatening to swallow her whole. One evening, as Sarah sat on the couch, she received a call from her best friend, Emma. "How are you holding up?" Emma's voice was soft, but there was an underlying concern. Sarah didn't know how to answer. She wasn't holding up at all. Her world had been turned upside down. She thought about telling Emma everything. All the pain, all the lies. But a part of her still wasn't ready to face the truth. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know." Emma was silent for a moment, and Sarah could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "You don't have to go through this alone, Sarah," Emma finally said. "You deserve better." The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She didn't feel like she deserved anything at that moment, especially not better. But deep down she knew Emma was right. She did deserve more than this. And yet, it wasn't that easy to let go. The next few days were filled with emotional chaos. Sarah couldn't escape the constant barrage of thoughts and emotions that kept flooding her mind. She tried to go about her day-to-day routine, but everything felt different. The simplest tasks felt monumental, like she was walking through life in a fog. Jake had tried to talk to her, but Sarah refused to engage. She couldn't bring herself to listen to his empty apologies, knowing that nothing would ever erase what had happened. She spent hours lost in her thoughts, her mind constantly replaying the events over and over again. She thought about the future, about whether she could ever trust again, or whether it was even worth trying. A part of her wanted to believe that there was a chance to heal, but another part knew that the damage had already been done. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. Sarah knew she couldn't go on like this forever. The silence was unbearable, but so was the idea of facing the truth. She had to make a decision. Stay and try to rebuild her trust, or leave and try to find herself again. She felt paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The thought of being alone terrified her, but the thought of staying with someone who had betrayed her was even worse. As the days passed, she realized that she could never be the same person she was before. The woman who had blindly trusted Jake was gone. In her place was someone who had been shattered, but was slowly piecing herself back together. Sarah knew she had to start somewhere, even if that meant walking away from the person she thought she would spend her life with. The hardest part wasn't saying goodbye. It was finding the strength to let go. As the days went by, Sarah could no longer ignore the growing sense of unease. Her mind, once filled with questions and confusion, now buzzed with suspicion. Every time Jake left the room or took a phone call, she felt her heart race. He had become more distant in recent days, more elusive. The little things that used to reassure her now seemed like part of the puzzle. A missed call, a text left unread, a fleeting glance that didn't quite reach her. She had tried to dismiss these signs before, telling herself she was overthinking it. But now, she couldn't help but wonder, was he hiding something from her again? The doubts were building in her mind, and she couldn't stop herself from searching for the truth. She hadn't gone through his phone, but the temptation was growing stronger each day. Was it possible he was lying to her again? Could she really trust him? Every second felt like a ticking clock, and Sarah was starting to run out of time. The next morning, as Jake left for work, Sarah found herself unable to stay still. She couldn't focus on anything. Every minute felt like an eternity. She knew she couldn't let this go any longer. She had to know the truth. As soon as Jake's car pulled out of the driveway, Sarah walked into the living room and stared at his phone, which he had left on the coffee table. Her heart pounded in her chest, but a voice in her head told her she had to do it. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it. The screen flashed, and she hesitated for a moment. Was this what she needed to do? But the fear of living with the unknown overwhelmed her. She scrolled through his messages, and her eyes landed on a thread that made her stomach drop. The text was innocent enough, but there was something about it, something in the tone, that set off alarms in her mind. She had found something, but now she had to figure out what it all meant. Sarah didn't know how long she stood there, reading through the texts. Each message she uncovered felt like a dagger to her chest. There were exchanges that seemed too personal, too intimate. Jake had been careful, hiding his tracks, but the truth was in front of her now. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was reading. The messages were from someone named Ava, a name Sarah didn't recognize. They were flirting, sharing inside jokes, talking about meeting up. Her hands began to shake as she realized the depth of the betrayal. The pain of seeing it in black and white hit her like a physical blow. Sarah set the phone down with trembling hands and backed away slowly, her breath catching in her throat. This was worse than she imagined. She had known there was something off, but seeing it confirmed, seeing the lies so clearly. It was almost too much to bear. She wanted to scream, to confront him right then and there, but she didn't. Instead, she stood frozen, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Sarah spent the rest of the day in a haze. Her thoughts were consumed by the messages. She couldn't shake the image of Jake's face when she confronted him earlier, the way he tried to explain things away. She had seen the way he hesitated before answering her questions, the way he avoided her gaze. All of it made sense now, and yet it didn't. Sarah had always believed in him, trusted him, loved him. But now, she didn't know who he was anymore. The man she had spent so many years with was a stranger. The betrayal cut deep, but what hurt more was the fact that she had let herself ignore all the signs. Had she been too naive? Too trusting? Her emotions were all over the place. Anger, sadness, confusion, and fear swirled inside her. She wanted to confront Jake, demand answers, but a part of her wasn't sure if she could handle the truth. She was torn between wanting to know everything and wanting to escape from the hurt. That night, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore, stuck in the web of lies and doubts. She needed answers, but more than that, she needed to take control of her life again. The idea of confronting Jake terrified her, but she knew she couldn't let him dictate her emotions any longer. When Jake came home that evening, Sarah was waiting for him. Her heart raced as he stepped through the door, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew this conversation would change everything, and that terrified her. But she had to do it. For her own sanity, for her own peace of mind, she had to confront the man who had broken her trust. She stood up, her voice steady but firm. "We need to talk," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. Jake's face fell, but there was no going back now. The truth was about to be laid bare. The moment Jake stepped into the living room, Sarah could no longer hold back. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, the words hanging on her lips. "I know about Ava," she said, her voice steady but filled with pain. Jake froze, his face paling as the reality of the situation hit him. He opened his mouth to speak, but faltered. Sarah's gaze was unwavering, her eyes now sharp with determination. She had waited for the right moment, for a time when she could finally confront him, and now it had come. "Who is she, Jake? Why were you texting her like that?" The silence between them felt suffocating. Jake shifted uneasily on his feet, looking everywhere but at Sarah. His inability to speak only confirmed the truth that Sarah had feared. It wasn't just a fling, it was something more. This was the moment of truth. No more excuses, no more lies. "Tell me the truth, Jake," Sarah demanded, her voice now a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Jake tried to explain, his words tumbling out in a rushed and disjointed mess. "It's not what you think, Sarah," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Sarah, her arms crossed, stood firm, not buying his excuses anymore. She could feel the knot in her stomach tighten with every word he spoke. "Don't lie to me," she replied coldly. The truth was out now, and no matter how hard Jake tried to spin his story, it wouldn't change what was already broken between them. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal, it was all laid out in front of her. Sarah wasn't sure what hurt more, the lies or the realization that the man she had loved for years was capable of such betrayal. She could see the cracks in him now, his desperation to justify himself only deepening her resolve. "You're not the man I thought you were," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jake's face fell as he tried to reach out to her, but Sarah took a step back, unable to listen anymore. Jake's silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. He had no answer for her, just an uncomfortable, nervous shift of his gaze. Sarah could feel the anger building inside her, like a wave ready to crash over everything. "You've been seeing her for months, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low but tinged with rage. The reality was more painful than she could have imagined. Jake didn't deny it. Instead, he looked down, as if the shame of his actions weighed more heavily than any defense he could offer. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. She wasn't going to cry in front of him, not anymore. "How could you do this to me, Jake? I trusted you. I loved you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. The words felt like knives as they left her mouth, and she could see the guilt on his face. But it wasn't enough. His remorse was too little, too late. The betrayal had cut too deep. Sarah stepped back, the weight of the truth settling like a stone in her chest. "Are you going to tell me the truth now?" Sarah demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. She had given him every chance to come clean, but now she could see he had no intention of doing so on his own. Jake opened his mouth, but seemed to lose his voice as he struggled to find the right words. The silence stretched on, unbearable, until Sarah couldn't take it any longer. "I don't need your words, Jake," she said, turning away from him. "I need you to show me the truth, not hide behind excuses." His apologies felt empty now, meaningless, as if they were only words meant to ease his own guilt. "You've already shown me who you are," she added, her voice firm with finality. She could see the pain on his face, but it no longer mattered. The damage had been done, and there was no taking it back. Sarah's heart felt like it was breaking in her chest, but she couldn't let him see it. She had to be strong, not for him, but for herself. Jake finally spoke, his voice quiet and strained. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for it to go this far." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. His words, once so meaningful, now felt hollow. She had heard them too many times before. The apology came too late, just like everything else. She could see the desperation in his eyes, but it no longer moved her. She had spent too much time living in denial, holding on to the hope that things would get better. Now all that was left was the painful truth. She took one last look at Jake, feeling the weight of the finality of this moment. "Goodbye, Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, alone. The room, once filled with shared memories, now felt completely empty. Sarah didn't look back. She had no reason to. The tension between Sarah and Jake reached its boiling point. Sarah could no longer hold the floodgates of her emotions. Her heart was breaking, but the rage had taken over. "How long, Jake?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fury. How long were you going to keep lying to me? Jake stood there speechless for a moment, his face filled with guilt and shame. He had nothing left to say. The weight of his lies had suffocated him. Sarah could feel her chest tightening as her anger bubbled over. She had spent so much time convincing herself that things would get better, that Jake would change. But he hadn't. And now, everything had fallen apart. I don't want your lies anymore, Sarah continued, her voice sharp and unforgiving. I've had enough of pretending that this isn't happening. I've had enough of you. Jake's eyes welled with tears, but Sarah wasn't moved. The betrayal was too deep to forgive. Jake took a step forward, his voice cracking as he said, I never meant to hurt you, Sarah. But the words felt hollow. They were the same words he had said before, but now they didn't have the same weight. Sarah shook her head, the tears she had been holding back finally starting to fall. If you didn't mean to hurt me, why did you do it, Jake? Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning? The pain was unbearable, and it spread through her like wildfire. Jake's hands dropped to his sides, his body trembling with the weight of his actions. He couldn't offer an explanation that would make things better. There was no excuse for what he had done. Sarah had known that from the moment she found out about Ava. But now, standing face to face with Jake, the gravity of the situation crushed her. I trusted you. I loved you, she whispered, her voice cracking. And you threw it all away. Sarah's voice became quieter, more resolute. I've been living in your lies for so long, Jake. I've been begging for the truth, and all you've given me are excuses. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced with all the moments that led to this. The late nights, the empty promises, the excuses. All of them were lies. All of them had been building to this moment. I can't do this anymore, she said, the finality in her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah held up her hand, silencing him. I don't need to hear it, Jake. I've heard enough. The hurt in her eyes was evident, but she had no more tears to shed. She was done. Jake's face twisted with sorrow, but Sarah could see that the time for apologies had passed. This wasn't something he could fix anymore. Not with words. Jake's voice finally broke through the silence. Please, Sarah, don't leave me. I'm sorry, I'll do anything to make it right. But Sarah didn't flinch. She had heard the promises before, and they always ended in disappointment. You had your chance, she replied coldly. You've shown me who you really are, and I can't live with that anymore. Jake's face twisted with desperation, and he took a step closer to her. Please, don't go, he pleaded. But Sarah stood her ground, her feet planted firmly on the floor. I'm not the same person I was before all this, Jake, she said, her voice steady, but filled with finality. And I can't keep pretending like everything is okay when it's not. She could see the pain in his eyes, but it didn't change anything. The betrayal was too deep, and the trust was gone. There was nothing left for her to hold on to. Sarah turned away, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had just made. As she reached the door, she heard Jake's voice one last time, calling her name. Sarah, please. His voice cracked, but she didn't look back. She had made her choice. She had to leave. The door closed softly behind her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't because she was happy, but because she was finally free from the suffocating weight of the lies. The uncertainty, the pain. It was over. Sarah stepped out into the night, the cool air filling her lungs as she walked away from everything she had known. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking control of her life again. The world outside felt wide open, and she was ready to move forward. The days after leaving Jake were a blur. Sarah found herself grappling with the enormity of her decision, but it didn't take long for her to realize she was no longer weighed down by the lies. There was a lightness in her step that she hadn't felt in years. She started rebuilding her life, one small step at a time. Her mornings were quieter now, free from the tension that had once filled every corner of her home. The healing hadn't been instant. It never was, but it had begun. Sarah spent time focusing on herself. She revisited old hobbies, spent evenings with friends, and allowed herself to enjoy her own company again. She started to see her worth beyond the relationship. While part of her still longed for the love she thought she had with Jake, she was slowly learning to love herself again. The scars would always remain, but they no longer defined her. She had taken control back, and she was finally beginning to feel like herself again. Sarah sat at a cafe with her best friend Emma. "It's strange, you know," Sarah said, swirling her coffee. "I never thought I'd be here, not just surviving, but actually feeling good again." Emma smiled, her eyes warm with support. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah." Sarah smiled back, grateful for the support she had received, but she still felt a bit uncertain. "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust again," Sarah admitted, her voice thoughtful. "But I can't keep letting this define me." Emma nodded in understanding. "You've been through so much, but you're learning, you're growing, and that's all you can do." Sarah felt the weight of the conversation, but also a sense of acceptance. She was learning to move forward, not to forget, but to heal. It wasn't easy, but for the first time Sarah felt like she was in control of her future. One evening, as Sarah walked home from work, she passed by a small bookstore that she used to visit with Jake. For a moment, the memories rushed back, and she felt a pang in her chest. She stopped for a moment, staring at the familiar storefront. She had spent so many quiet hours there reading and laughing with him. But tonight, there was no sadness, no regrets. She realized that part of her had needed to walk this path, to experience the hurt, to reclaim herself from it. She wasn't the same person who walked into that bookstore months ago. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, to be stronger than the pain that once held her back. The bookstore was just a building now, no longer filled with memories of her past relationship. With a deep breath, Sarah smiled to herself and kept walking, knowing that the past no longer controlled her future. A phone call from Jake came unexpectedly one afternoon. Sarah had almost forgotten how his voice sounded. "I just wanted to check in," he said softly. "I know I've hurt you, but I hope you're doing okay." Sarah paused, unsure of how to respond. She had moved on so much from that time, but hearing his voice stirred something inside her. She hadn't anticipated that he would reach out. She took a deep breath and spoke. "I'm doing fine, Jake. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just moving forward." The silence on the other end told her that Jake hadn't expected this response. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly. "I know," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "But I can't go back, Jake. I have to keep going forward." She hung up the phone, feeling a sense of closure. It wasn't that she had forgiven him, but rather, she had forgiven herself for staying too long in the wrong place. As the weeks passed, Sarah continued to reclaim her life. She had reconnected with old friends, gone on solo trips, and rediscovered passions she had long forgotten. The process of healing wasn't linear, but it was moving forward. Sarah looked at herself in the mirror one evening, noticing the quiet strength that had developed inside her. She wasn't who she had been when Jake first entered her life. She was stronger, more confident, and more sure of who she was. And though the scars from the past would always remain, they no longer defined her. "I've got this," Sarah whispered to herself, a smile playing on her lips. She was finally free. Free from the lies, free from the heartache, and free to be the woman she had always been meant to be. The future was bright, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt ready to embrace it. The phone buzzed once again. Sarah didn't recognize the number. It had been months since she last heard from Jake, and part of her thought she had finally left him behind. She stared at the screen for a moment, unsure whether to answer. In that instant, her mind was flooded with memories, the love, the trust, the hurt. But she had come so far since then, hadn't she? She had built herself up from the wreckage of their relationship. The woman she was now had learned to live without Jake, without the constant lies. Taking a deep breath, Sarah hit decline and turned the phone over, pushing it away. She had heard enough from him. The past was in the past and she wasn't going back. The phone buzzed again, but she didn't even look. She had made peace with what had happened. She had healed, and she had learned to trust herself again. There was nothing left to discuss. She was done. Sarah was walking down the street, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't running from the past or worried about bumping into Jay. The weight she had carried for so long was finally lifted. She had taken control of her life, and now, the world around her seemed full of possibilities. She had no idea where she was going, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was moving forward. With each step, she felt the sense of freedom grow stronger. The city was busy around her, but she felt completely at peace in her own skin. She was no longer defined by the betrayal, nor the person she used to be. As she walked, she thought about all the lessons she had learned, the strength she had found within herself, the friends who had helped her, and the quiet confidence that now filled her heart. Sarah stopped at a bench in the park, the same one she had sat at during the days when she questioned everything. Those days were behind her now. She sat down, closing her eyes for a moment, and letting the cool breeze brush her face. Life had a way of testing you, she thought, but the most important part was how you chose to rise afterward. She had fallen hard, but she had risen even stronger. She opened her eyes and looked around, noticing how different the world seemed now that she had come to terms with everything. The pain, the heartbreak, they had faded into the background of her life. She had found a new sense of clarity. Sarah wasn't angry anymore, nor was she bitter. She was simply thankful for the lessons life had taught her. She had learned to trust herself, and that was the most important thing of all. Later that night, Sarah sat by the window in her apartment, staring out at the city lights. The night had a sense of quiet finality to it. She had come a long way since that first painful revelation. There were still scars, of course, but they had shaped her into the person she was becoming, someone stronger, more self-aware, and ready to face whatever life threw at her. Sarah knew that she would never forget the love she once had for Jake, but she also knew that she was no longer trapped by it. She had learned to let go, and in doing so, she had learned to live for herself. For the first time in a long time, Sarah was truly at peace with who she was and where she was going. She was ready for whatever new adventures awaited her. As Sarah stood at the door ready to step out into the world once more, she paused and took one last look at the apartment. It was more than just a space to live now. It was a symbol of her growth, her independence. She had turned this place into her sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild and heal. Sarah took a deep breath and smiled to herself. She was no longer the woman who had been broken by betrayal. She was a woman who had found her strength again, who had learned to trust herself above all else. As she stepped out into the world, she knew that the future was hers to shape. With one final glance at the apartment, Sarah closed the door softly behind her, stepping into a new chapter of her life.